Kia e te whānau, welcome to Raw Politics, Newsroom's weekly podcast that does pretty much what it says on the packet. I am Newsroom political editor Laura Walters, and it's so nice to be back with you after a couple of weeks away. I am joined, of course, in Wellington with Newsroom senior political reporter Marc Daalder. And before we go any further, Marc, I just wanted to say you did such a fantastic job hosting Raw Politics the past couple of weeks, and I thought your reo was on point for Te Wiki o Te Reo Māori.
Thank you very much, Laura.
And as always, we have Tim Murphy joining us from Auckland Newsroom's co-editor. Hey, Tim.
Hi, Laura. I thought your intro there about us delivering what's on the packet with Raw Politics was a dig at how raw we were without you.
Not a bad thing. Look, before we kick into the substance of this week's episode, I thought that we could just have a quick chat about the vice presidential debate. We are recording this episode just as the debate wraps up, and I'm interested to get your hot takes. Marc is the American in the room. What do you reckon?
Sometimes you wish you weren't, right? It's been something to watch, hasn't it? And there's only however many weeks till election day, so we'll get this all done with sooner or later. January 6th, I guess, is the date we're all really waiting for.
Or dreading.
Yeah.
And what about you, Tim? What were your takeaways on first glance?
Well, these debates are essential watching for people who look at politics and campaigns, right? The principles of what we see in that debate across borders and across sort of campaigns and elections. We got two candidates, one who was slick and poised and pretty good with getting out just messages they want to get out and kept the tone right, and one who was nervous, new to this kind of forum, and this is Waltz, and didn't take his chances to push back hard, even on subjects as detailed and as what he would be so familiar with laws in his own state. So it was interesting, really. The expectation would be that you had a sort of a, informal, very good talker, very good personality, a big presence who you'd think would come across well in this, and a bit of an uptight, oddball, bit of a policy wonk, but that didn't occur on either side of the debate. So it's interesting. And, they're vice presidential candidates, so it doesn't sway, states or votes necessarily, but it does probably rehabilitate JD Vance a bit. He's come a long way from the couch, memes through now to being a credible kind of presence in a debate.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, last time we called it on the presidential debate to Kamala Harris, and I think this time just on the debate itself, we're all calling it for JD Vance. My thought was, if it's a really, really tight race, they don't necessarily have to pick one vice president, right? Like, I've heard that you can do a job share and they could potentially do co-vice president. You don't have to be in the same party. You don't have to necessarily like each other.
To be clear, it's not co-vice president. It's not co-deputy prime minister. It's just one would be vice president for the first half and then the other would be vice president for the second half.
We could pitch it to them. We're trialling it in New Zealand at the moment. Anyway, with that aside, today on Raw Politics, we will be taking a look at Christopher Luxon's property perception problems. We'll also be looking at the Green Party's ongoing Darleen Tana saga and Damien O'Connor's risky retweets. And as always, to wrap up, we will offer you some recommendations. This past weekend, the Prime Minister finally moved into Premier House. It's taken a while, but he got there. So far, so standard. But in doing so, he has also decided to sell his Wellington apartment. That's the Kate Shepherd apartment just across the road from Parliament that he bought when he first became an MP. He's also sold another one of his Auckland properties, leaving him with some pretty tidy capital gains in the past month. Now, RNZ reported about the Prime Minister's move at the start of the week, and this was quickly followed up by some reporting by TVNZ where they looked specifically at how much Luxon had bought these properties for, how much he had sold them for, and the gains that he had made based on TVNZ's figures. we know that the Wellington apartment sold for about $975,000. It is yet to settle, but that's the number that he was looking at. That would make him about $180,000 in capital gains. And his Onehunga property in Auckland, he would be making around $280,000 in profit on that one. Of course, there's nothing wrong with what he's doing here. It's all completely legal. It's all completely above board. And I'm sure Christopher Luxon would tell us all he's entitled to those capital gains. But it does, again, raise these questions around how Luxon talks about his wealth, whether this makes him relatable to, middle New Zealand, true blue New Zealand that he always talks about knowing so well, and whether it exposes him at all as out of touch when he uses quotes like, and I wrote this one down, "Let's be clear, I'm wealthy, I'm sorted," and of course from February, "I'm entitled." Now, there's quite a lot to unpack here, but Marc, I thought perhaps we could start with you, rewind a little bit. You had a fantastic scoop back in February around that accommodation allowance that Christopher Luxon was receiving in order to, $52,000, I think, in order to stay in his own apartment, which he owned, and everything's kind of this discussion has kind of walked on since then, hasn't it? It's all related to that and how he deals with his own personal property and talks about his own wealth. I wondered whether you might be able to step us through what's happened there, how he's handled it.
Yes. It all did start in February in a conversation with a cricketer, in fact, I think a visiting Australian cricketer, about how he wasn't staying in Premier House. That raised some questions about why not? Well, it needs some renovations, fair enough. Where are you staying? My apartment in Wellington, fair enough. Are you claiming the $52,000 a year in taxpayer money that's available for MPs who don't live in Wellington to cover their housing costs, to live in your apartment that you own without a mortgage? I am. Why not? He's entitled. That was the start of it, right? And that created this big focus on Premier House, on the renovations, on when it would be ready. Luxon really wanted it to be a conversation about Premier House because from that perspective, you can't live somewhere if it's actively being renovated.
Though I will just jump in there, Marc, and say that we did receive some official documentation from DIA that said while there were renovations going on, he could have lived in there throughout that time. Just worth noting there. But yes, renovations he didn't want to live in.
Yeah, and from my perspective, if he never wanted to live in Premier House and just wanted to stay in the apartment, that always would have been fine. The issue was these accommodation allowances are specifically meant, intended to help MPs with the costs of working in two different places as part of that job. And those weren't costs Luxon faced because he owned an apartment completely mortgage-free in Wellington and owned, multiple properties in Auckland without a mortgage as well. And so it did feel like, he saw an opportunity to get some money and took it. And hey, who wouldn't? But in the culture of kind of fiscal prudence that he's trying to establish, the discussions about the waste of taxpayer money, it was just an obviously, clearly bad look from the start. Something that he should have avoided from the moment he saw he had that opportunity.
And what do you think about this, Tim? I mean, in the past week, and this has happened before as well, we've talked about Christopher Luxon's properties. Previously, he owned 7 properties. Obviously, that's changed now with some of these sales, but he's been criticised for receiving almost $500,000 in capital gains for these 2 recent sales. He also sold outside of that 2-year window, which means it's not subject to the bright line test, so all tax-free. That's been the focus of the criticism this week. I'm wondering whether you think that is a fair criticism or whether there's actually a different issue or problem here.
I was going to say he can't win, and you can't win on this because, but I think actually having thought about it, that he could and you can win, but I'll deal with that in a moment. There's a sort of a third way of doing it. But on this one, he had 7 properties. People criticised him for that, for being full of largesse and getting the landlord benefit on the one and only hunga, for sure, that this government created by that tax relief, right? So he was going to benefit from that. So obviously he's not benefiting anymore from that one and only hunga, and he won't apply to the one he was living in, but he will get some benefit now. So, he had a whole lot of properties. Now he's not got so many properties. So he presumably should get some benefit for not being a rack renter and a sort of a collector of homes. The other thing about it is, he can and should be able to dispose of his assets, whatever they are, so long as there's no hint of conflict or compromise to the political and the policy. And this is what I was going to say, is that I think there probably is a way of doing this and keeping the political damage at bay. And that was what John Key did with his wealth, with a blind trust, and let them decide. So we'd know if those properties were being sold, but they wouldn't be timed and decided by the owner, in this case, Luxon. So he'd be able to say, well, look, the people who look after this have decided what they're doing, and that's up to them.
I think the one other element of the bright line test criticism in particular is that the 2-year test has been downgraded to 2 years from 10 years by this government. And had that change not happened, he would have had to pay capital gains on the Wellington apartment, not the Auckland house still. There's not a world in which he has made this move specifically so that he can avoid a capital gains tax. I think suggesting that would be pretty ridiculous. But it makes him an example of the kind of person who specifically benefits from the changes the government has made.
That's completely right. And so I was going to try and get to that, and I'm being long-winded here. But the damage in this is, I think, the representative damage, as Marc says, and especially when you allow yourself to say, I'm wealthy, I'm sorted. 4 words in a headline in Stuff with his photograph, which will appear for years. They'll last longer than I'm entitled, because I'm wealthy, I'm sorted is kind of, I'm all right, Jack, basically. That's the damage, and that's where he doesn't play the political strategy or know where the dangers are coming from as much as he might. He probably thinks, if I front up and say, yeah, okay, I've got lots of money, so what? That gets past it. But I think it actually embeds it and makes it look like here's a person who's got so much in terms of their wealth and assets that they're all right. And even though many people out there aren't, I think he can't be criticized in every direction, but he can be criticized on the houses, but he can be criticized on the political management of it and his attitude that comes through. That's all.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that messaging, isn't it? It's almost like, and I think we've discussed this briefly before in relation to the accommodation allowance, Marc, around him and his team not necessarily seeing these issues coming down the pipeline. They should be able to know that people will ask questions about this. He almost seems a bit put out or perturbed every time somebody asks about his own personal circumstances. We've seen it when people ask about his faith. We've seen it when people question his wealth and his property ownership. As Prime Minister of New Zealand, he should expect these types of questions. He should expect this type of scrutiny, especially, like you say, everyone's got to tighten their belts. Kiwis are out there suffering, not me. I'm wealthy, I'm sorted. But, in this environment, in this context, they should be able to see these questions and these issues coming. And every time they pop up, they almost look like they're caught off guard. He doesn't have good messaging. He doesn't seem to have a good comms strategy around this, which is quite surprising to me. And it made me wonder, do they not think that this hurts them with those voters? Do maybe, I would have thought typically Middle New Zealand doesn't love tall poppies, doesn't love people who come off as arrogant, rich people. But potentially some of those people are aspiring to be like Luxon, are aspiring to own property, are aspiring to be wealthy and okay. And so potentially it doesn't hurt them with those voters. I'd be interested to hear what you two think about that, how it plays with that voter base.
Well, I think there's one thing is that there's an issue of etiquette and taste as well, that if you're truly wealthy, you don't say, I'm wealthy.
I think the other thing is, Luxon is fond of telling people that they should get out of the Beltway more. It's maybe advice that he needs to take on himself because I think he has this perception that his comments are coming across one way and they're coming across a very different way. And if you think, really, who does Christopher Luxon, the Prime Minister, engage with on a daily basis? It's definitely not people outside the Beltway.
And when the press gallery asks questions about this, he believes that it only matters to the press gallery. You know, he will say that's such a Beltway or bubble question or issue. No one cares about this, but actually they likely do. And I think that an interesting space to watch around this will be his comms team. You know, this has been reported that his chief press secretary, Hamish Rutherford, is going to be leaving, I understand, at the end of the year. So there could be a bit of a shake-up in that team who's giving him advice around this messaging. And it will be interesting to see whether his approach to these types of issues, particularly relating to his personal situation and his wealth, changes at all, or whether it stays the same.
On one other level, he is doing his bit to stimulate one industry, the real estate sector. If he does another 4 or 5, he'll sort of get himself out of the original political problem of owning 7 properties. So, you know, keep going, Chris.
Yeah, that's the sector that people in New Zealand always have their hearts feeling most torn about. Is what does this mean for our brave frontline real estate agents?
The Green Party cannot seem to shake the issue of ousted MP Darleen Tana. This one has been hanging around for them for a while, and it doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon. We have spoken about this before on Raw Politics, and rather than unpacking the entire Tana saga again, I will try my best to give us a bit of a bullet-pointed timeline, and then we'll get to where we are now. So here are some of the facts. Tana was stood down by the Green Party earlier this year after suggestions that she had information or some kind of involvement with migrant exploitation at her husband's e-bike business. The investigation found that Tana had not been entirely upfront with the Green Party in her discussions about what she knew and when, and then the caucus was going to ask her to resign, and she decided to resign instead, essentially jumped before she could be booted. But she has consistently refused to resign from Parliament, something that the Green Party has repeatedly asked her to do. Then the Green Party was left with a bit of a conundrum, essentially boot her out of Parliament using the waka jumping legislation that they have been so vehemently opposed to for such a long time, or let her stay in Parliament as an independent MP and essentially block the Green Party from bringing in the next MP on their list. Most recently, Tana filed an application for a judicial review in the courts. That application was against the party co-leaders as well as the party. She has recently lost that application, so now they're kind of back to what do we do? Do we waka jump Darleen Tana or do we let her stay? And the big question is, what now for the Greens? What now for Darleen Tana? Mark, can you give us a little bit of what you think needs to happen now and what the Greens' options are within all of this big mess?
Yeah, so it's worth remembering that the initial judicial review came in an attempt to get an injunction against the Greens holding a special general meeting as a party, not a caucus, so the membership involved as well, to determine whether or not the membership is okay with the caucus invoking the waka jumping bill. And they say if the membership says no, we won't do it. If they say yes, presumably they will. Since that court case, the Greens have now rescheduled that special general meeting for October 17th, the 4-year anniversary of the previous election, the 2020 election, and just a couple of days after the year anniversary of the most recent one when Darleen Tana became an MP. So the question is now, what will the membership say there?
So we're looking to October 17th as potentially finally giving us a bit of a decision on what the Greens are going to do next. I mean, what do you think should happen there, Tim? What is going to hurt the party more? Is it Darleen Tana hanging around as an independent, or is it the Greens essentially exposing themselves as hypocrites re the waka jumping legislation? Which way do you think they should play it?
I'm a bit old-fashioned on this one. I think an MP becomes and is signed in and sworn in, I should say, into Parliament as a parliamentarian. And that is a superseding status, in my view, to being a member of a party. So I think that she has the right to stay, and I don't agree with the waka jumping law in that respect. However, I don't think the Greens expose themselves to a whole lot of hypocrisy for any lasting time. Here we are 2 years out from the next election. If they can do it, it's best it be done quickly from their point of view. They'll get temporary kind of, criticism from some, but obviously the other side of politics who support the waka jumping legislation can't poke the bone at them in that respect. There'll be a bit of hypocrisy allegation, and then they've done it and she's gone. I think probably it's crazy for her to stay on in her own right. I think she ought to be considering, do I want to stay in a hostile environment, a solo role where I can't do a whole lot? I get one question in Parliament every 20 or something, every month or whatever it'll be. Not much support, not much sort of a policy platform to back. What's the point, Darleen, really? That she can, in my view, she has that status and it's hers to protect. But I would think that she probably should weigh that up. The Greens can do it. If they do it now, won't damage them in 2 years.
I'm interested, Tim, in your personal belief on someone being sworn as a parliamentarian and that superseding them being a member of the party. Does that change based on whether they're a list MP and essentially get in on the party vote, or whether they're an electorate MP? Because it's, I think, worth noting that Darleen Tana is a list MP. Yeah,
and I think that probably people would argue it does. I don't. I think you've come into Parliament, you're a parliamentarian representing the people, and in your case, the broad brush of the electorate, not just an area. But I know that people with greater scholarly knowledge than me will oppose that view.
Tim, is that an oblique reference to Winston Peters?
People with far more expertise than I might say. I said, Mark, you take from that what you like.
I did want to mention the one other, example. We do have some historic kind of comparisons here, and that's National with Jamie Lee Ross about the same time in the kind of electoral cycle. And I think it would be fair to say he was at least as disruptive, probably much more disruptive, to be honest, to National than Darleen Tana has been to the Greens. But they did say, look, we voted against the waka jumping legislation, and so we won't use it on him. So you can expect comparisons like that to be drawn if they do go ahead and kick out Darleen Tana.
Whatever they decide to do, they need to decide quickly, don't they? They need to make a final decision, draw a line under this mess and move on. Our audience question for this week is, how come Labour MP Damien O'Connor essentially got away with, or got a pass to retweet that Palestinians have every right to do whatever they did on October the 7th? Mark, can you start by telling us a little bit around the context of this tweet and Damien O'Connor's retweeting track record?
Yeah, Damien should follow the advice that Joe Moyer, our former host, gives to every politician, which is politicians should not be on Twitter. Continues to be the case. Never ever has a politician done something on Twitter and got votes from it, but boy, have they messed up on Twitter. And Damien O'Connor is one of the most prolific tweeters, I think would be fair to say.
And retweeters.
And he's got, very strong views on this issue in particular. He's vocal about them in Parliament. He is Labour's Associate Foreign Affairs spokesperson. But he's also vocal on social media, where you lose the ability to have face-to-face conversations with people and the ability to use nuance when you're limited to 280 characters. Assuming he wanted to engage in a nuanced discussion in the first place, which is, maybe a premise that we can discuss.
So he's got a bit of a track record here. He's got form. I mean, what did you think about this, Tim? What was he thinking, and why hasn't Labour come down harder on him?
Yeah, it's inexplicable, isn't it? How anyone who has been a diplomat, because he's been a trade diplomat for New Zealand, represented us at APEC last year when there was no government, remember? So here's a person who's aware of and exposed to international affairs and dealings, and that's part of his portfolio role. But how you could retweet, even but then to retweet something that said every right to do whatever it was they did. Those two things, we all know there were some absolutely heinous things done in great number and great measure, way out of line with anything that's defensible. But how you could look at that even quickly and race over it and think, I'll give that a bit of a push, is inexplicable to me, and does very much bring into, question judgment. Judgment or what state he might have been in and what time of the day it might have been when he was pushing retweet, to be honest.
I would say as well, and we will tread very carefully here, but it could be worth mentioning that a few months back, he also retweeted a tweet that did breach court suppressions in a high-profile case. And when Newsroom, I think it was you, Mark, rang up the Labour Party and asked some questions about it, I don't even think that they were aware that it had been done, but it kind of just builds a bit of a picture here that he kind of just rolls with whatever. He's a bit fast and loose with these things. And when you have face-to-face discussions with Damien, you get that sense too. He says what he wants to say, when he wants to say it. He has a little bit of a IDGAF kind of mentality around things. I'm trying to think of what's okay for the pod to say there.
You could swear on Raw Politics. There's no broadcasting standards.
Okay,
authority.
well, there you go. He just doesn't give a fuck. You know, I feel like he's been in this game for long enough and he's just like, if I'm going down swinging kind of mentality. You know, he doesn't pull punches. He doesn't self-censor. But there should be some discussions between him and Labour Party leadership or Labour Party comms, I think, around things like this that are very sensitive and potentially very problematic for him and the wider party.
Do you think that the part of the reason he hasn't been slapped down harder is because Chris Hipkins isn't here? If Hipkins was here, do you think he would do something about it?
Potentially.
Well, surely. Yes, it's fine to be out in the world and say I don't give an F, but he obviously did, because before they got to him, according to them, he removed it and unretweeted it. So he obviously saw something, and there's no way in the world that he can't not give a F over slaughter, rape, and everything else. Of course he does, surely, and I'm sure he does, give a F about that. So it's a bit of a strange situation to unpick. And then therefore, especially with the party with the role of Associate Foreign Affairs, easiest thing in the world for that party to say, look, we take this seriously. This is not just vile in its content, but it's showing a judgment that can't really hold for an Associate Foreign Affairs person who might go out and represent what Labour holds and stands for internationally. So I think
he should have been stripped of that portfolio?
Well, I think it would be a very straightforward thing at the least. And then, you'd have maybe Hipkins comes back and does that.
Let's wrap things up with our recommendations for the week, something that you have watched, read or listened to that you loved and you want to share with our audience. Tim, let's start with you.
Look, mine was the very good get, I think, for Sam Hayes and 3 News, the new 3 News, sitting down with John Key. He obviously chose his moment and chose to hold forth on all sorts of international issues, including Trump and local international controversy, but, really good to have a bit of that. And he gave lots of material again in his way for those who had and still probably have the John Key derangement syndrome.
It was a really fantastic piece. You're right. Great interview. Mark, what have you got for us this week?
I really enjoyed the piece in the press unveiling the very recently resigned chair of Canterbury, Peter Scott's vehicle and its GPS, which caught it speeding 678 times this year alone. It's an amazing read. They've got all the data there, but also just this is the future Simeon Brown wants for us.
Yeah, 105 in a 50k zone. It was a lot. Mine for this week is Marc Daalder's fantastic scoop on Newsroom on the unredacted legal advice regarding the government's oil and gas exploration policy that found or suggested that it would breach our international trade obligations. It's a great read. Marc has had a couple of these scoops recently based on this unredacted legal advice that we don't usually get to see. Well worth a read.
And can I just say that Raw Politics has a firm political policy decision: we stand against redaction.
Yeah,
we do in all its forms.
We'll release all of our planning emails for each episode, and people can see just how much derangement goes into putting this together.
That is it from Raw Politics for this week. Be sure to tune in next week for our special episode marking 1 year since the election. Thank you again to our producer Trent Doyle and our readers, listeners and viewers. If you have any burning thoughts that you need to share with us, please get in touch with me. My email is laura.walters@newsroom.co.nz. You can find us here next week on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.